The most dangerous thing about Napoleon is not that he existed. It's that, under the right conditions, many of us might have agreed with him. That sounds wrong at first. After all, Animal Farm is usually remembered as a warning about corruption, manipulation, and the abuse of power. Napoleon is the figure readers are supposed to distrust. He's the villain. The cautionary tale. The proof that revolutions can go terribly wrong. But what if that's not the most unsettling question the story leaves behind? What if the real mystery isn't how a figure like Napoleon gains power, but why communities so often decide they need someone like him in the first place? Because when most people read Animal Farm, they focus on the individual. They focus on the leader. Yet power rarely survives on personality alone. It survives because it answers a fear. And fear, throughout history, has often been more persuasive than freedom. Think about it. When uncertainty grows, when institutions weaken, when people feel that the future has become unpredictable, what becomes more valuable, liberty or stability? Principle or security? The right to disagree, or the comfort of believing someone is in control? That question sits quietly beneath the surface of Animal Farm, and it may be far more relevant today than many readers realize. Napoleon's role in the story is not merely that of a tyrant. He represents something larger. He represents the promise of order. The promise that confusion can be organized. That conflict can be managed. That anxiety can be reduced. And that is where the contradiction begins. Because history suggests that power is rarely accepted when it presents itself as domination. Power becomes durable when it presents itself as protection. That's the first uncomfortable insight. People do not always surrender freedom because it is taken from them. Sometimes they surrender it because certainty feels safer. And once that trade begins, it rarely announces itself with alarms. It happens gradually. A principle is adjusted. A question is discouraged. A rule is rewritten. Not enough to cause panic. Just enough to feel reasonable. One of the most haunting symbols in Animal Farm is not a character at all. It's the changing set of rules, the quiet transformation of standards that everyone believed were permanent. Not because truth disappears, but because memory becomes fragile. And that raises a larger question. If a society can no longer clearly remember what it once believed, how does it know when it has crossed a line? Because that line is the real mystery at the center of this story. The line between leadership and control. Between guidance and dependence. Between preserving order and preserving power. The unsettling part is that the boundary is rarely obvious while you're living through it. This is why Napoleon remained such a powerful figure decades after Animal Farm was written. Not because he is unique, but because he is recognizable. He appears whenever fear becomes stronger than trust, whenever stability becomes more valuable than accountability, whenever people become willing to exchange a little freedom for the promise of certainty. And perhaps that is the warning many readers overlook. The greatest threat was never one pig, one leader, or one regime. The greater threat may be a pattern, a cycle that repeats whenever communities become convinced that freedom is simply too risky. But if that's true, then a much bigger question emerges. Was Napoleon the cause of the problem? Or was he merely the result of something far deeper that existed long before he ever appeared? If fear helps create the conditions for a figure like Napoleon to rise, then another question immediately follows: why do people continue supporting a system even after it begins drifting away from its original ideals? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. Manipulation. Propaganda. Deception. But Animal Farm points toward something more complicated. Because a system does not become powerful simply because it controls information. It becomes powerful when people start depending on it emotionally. That distinction matters. A lie can be challenged. A dependency is much harder to break. And this is where one of the story's most overlooked figures becomes important, not as an individual, but as a symbol. Boxer represents something that exists in nearly every society, the belief that loyalty and hard work will always be rewarded. It is an admirable belief. In many ways, civilization itself depends on it. Yet Animal Farm quietly introduces a disturbing contradiction. What if virtue alone is not enough to protect people from systems that gradually change around them? That question pushes us deeper into the story's real conflict. Because the danger is not merely that power can become corrupt. The danger is that power can redefine what people consider normal. Think about how institutions work in the real world. Most people do not wake up one morning and decide to support a completely different set of values than they held the day before. Change usually happens in smaller steps. Expectations shift. Language evolves. Priorities are reordered. What once felt unacceptable begins to feel practical. What once felt temporary becomes permanent. And somewhere along the way, people stop asking whether the system still serves its original purpose. That is why one of the most powerful memory fragments in Animal Farm is the changing language surrounding the farm's rules. The rules themselves matter less than what they symbolize. They represent a terrifying possibility that truth may not disappear through force. It may disappear through adaptation. When people become busy, exhausted, distracted, or dependent, memory weakens. And when memory weakens, narratives become easier to reshape. This is where Napoleon's influence becomes larger than a single character. His true power is not physical control. His true power is narrative control. Not the ability to command behavior directly, but the ability to influence how people interpret reality itself. And once reality becomes negotiable, every institution enters dangerous territory. Because if yesterday's promise can be redefined today, what prevents today's promise from being redefined tomorrow? Notice how the scale of the conflict is expanding. What began as a question about one leader is becoming a question about culture. What began as a political issue is becoming a psychological one. And what began as a story about a farm is starting to look like a study of human nature. That shift reveals another uncomfortable insight. People often imagine freedom as the absence of control. But freedom also requires something far more demanding: responsibility. It requires memory, attention, skepticism, the willingness to tolerate uncertainty. Those qualities are difficult to maintain. Certainty is easier. Certainty reduces anxiety. Certainty simplifies choices. Certainty offers relief. And that may explain why societies repeatedly drift towards systems that promise clarity, even when those systems slowly narrow the space for disagreement. Which leads us closer to the mystery at the center of Animal Farm. Perhaps the greatest threat is not a ruler who seeks power. Perhaps it is a population that becomes exhausted enough to stop questioning it. But if that is true, then another paradox emerges. If communities help create the very systems that eventually limit them, where does responsibility actually begin, and who should bear it when the ideals of a revolution slowly transform into something else entirely? Before we can ask who is responsible for the transformation of a system, we have to confront an even more uncomfortable possibility. What if the problem is not the betrayal of ideals? What if the problem begins with the ideals themselves? That sounds almost heretical when discussing a story that is often interpreted as a warning about corruption. Yet Animal Farm repeatedly pushes us toward a deeper contradiction. Not the contradiction between good leaders and bad leaders. Not even the contradiction between freedom and control. A more dangerous contradiction. The conflict between human ideals and human nature. Because every revolutionary vision begins with a promise. A promise of fairness. A promise of equality. A promise that the mistakes of the past will not be repeated. But promises are abstract. Human beings are not. Human beings bring fear, ambition, insecurity, status, loyalty, resentment, and self-interest into every institution they create. And this is where the crisis begins. Many people assume that power changes people. But what if power is less of a transformation and more of a revelation? What if power simply exposes traits that were already there? That possibility changes everything. Because if power merely reveals human tendencies rather than creating them, then removing one leader does not solve the problem. Another leader eventually appears. Another structure emerges. Another hierarchy forms. And suddenly the story is no longer about politics. It becomes a question about civilization itself. Why do hierarchies keep returning? Why do systems designed to eliminate inequality often generate new forms of inequality? Why do communities that reject authority frequently rebuild authority under a different name? Those questions point toward something Animal Farm quietly understands. Order is not the opposite of freedom. Order is freedom's permanent competitor. Every society needs some degree of structure to survive. Rules create coordination. Institutions create predictability. Leadership creates direction. The paradox is that the very tools that make collective life possible can also become mechanisms of control. That is the contradiction at the heart of the story. The same structure that protects a community can eventually dominate it. The same narrative that unites people can eventually silence them. The same ideals that inspire a revolution can eventually justify its distortions. And perhaps no symbol captures this more effectively than the windmill. Most readers see it as a political symbol. But psychologically, it represents something even more powerful. The future. The promise that sacrifice today will create a better tomorrow. And once people become emotionally invested in a promised future, they often become willing to tolerate things they would otherwise reject. Not because they are irrational. Because hope itself can become a form of leverage. That realization expands the scale of the story once again. Now we are no longer talking about one farm. Or one movement. Or one era. We are talking about a recurring pattern that appears across nations, organizations, religions, corporations, and even personal relationships. The pattern is always slightly different. The mechanism is remarkably similar. A vision creates unity. Unity creates power. Power creates incentives. Incentives reshape behavior. Behavior reshapes institutions. And eventually the institution begins protecting itself. At that point, something subtle happens. The original mission becomes less important than preserving the system that was created to achieve it. This is the moment many people fail to recognize. Not because it is hidden. Because it feels reasonable. That may be the most chilling insight so far. The greatest dangers rarely arrive wearing the face of obvious evil. They arrive disguised as practical solutions. Necessary compromises. Temporary exceptions. Reasonable adjustments. And once those adjustments accumulate, an entire culture can wake up inside a reality that would have seemed unimaginable years earlier. Which brings us closer to the central mystery than ever before. If every system contains the seeds of its own transformation, if every ideal eventually encounters the limits of human nature, if every structure risks becoming self-protective over time, then perhaps the real question is not how power becomes corrupted. Perhaps the deeper question is whether any human system can remain faithful to its founding principles indefinitely, or whether the cycle itself is unavoidable. I want to challenge the assumption that the central figure in this story is the true source of power. Because by now, a different pattern is beginning to emerge. The most influential force is not a leader. It is not an institution. It is not even fear. The deeper force is something far less visible, the human desire for a coherent story. This is the revelation hiding beneath the political surface of Animal Farm. Human beings do not merely need food, security, or structure. They need meaning. They need a narrative that explains who they are, why they suffer, and what tomorrow is supposed to look like. And once a society becomes emotionally attached to a narrative, that narrative can become more powerful than reality itself. This changes how we understand the role of Napoleon. His greatest influence is not that he controls a system. His influence comes from becoming the guardian of a story. A story about progress. A story about necessity. A story about why every compromise is justified. Notice how different this is from the way power is usually discussed. Most people think power operates through commands. Animal Farm suggests something more profound. Durable power operates through interpretation. It shapes how people explain events to themselves. It determines which sacrifices feel meaningful and which questions feel dangerous. This is where another memory fragment becomes important. Consider the image of a community standing before symbols that once represented liberation, while no longer remembering exactly what those symbols originally meant. The tragedy is not ignorance. The tragedy is the gradual separation between symbols and their original purpose. Once that separation occurs, symbols become available for reuse. Ideals become tools. Language becomes flexible. Principles become negotiable. And a society can continue believing it is protecting its founding vision while slowly moving away from it. This is the philosophical heart of the story. Not the corruption of power, but the corruption of meaning. Because when meaning becomes unstable, almost anything can be justified. A policy can be justified. A restriction can be justified. A contradiction can be justified. Not because people suddenly become malicious, but because they sincerely believe they are defending something valuable. That is the deeper paradox. The most consequential transformations in history often occur when good intentions become disconnected from self-correction. When a system stops asking whether it is still serving its original purpose, preservation becomes more important than truth. And now the scale expands again. We are no longer examining political systems alone. We are examining civilizations, religions, corporations, cultural movements. Any structure built around a shared story faces the same challenge. How does it preserve identity without becoming trapped by it? How does it maintain stability without resisting necessary criticism? How does it protect meaning without turning meaning into doctrine? These questions lead us toward a revelation that may be even more unsettling than anything we have explored so far. Perhaps the ultimate danger is not that powerful people manipulate narratives. Perhaps the greater danger is that communities become so invested in a narrative that they begin protecting it from reality itself. And if that is true, then the central mystery is no longer about leadership, institutions, or even power. The mystery becomes something much larger. How can any society distinguish between a story that guides it and a story that has begun quietly controlling it? If a society can become attached to a narrative, and if that narrative can gradually become more important than reality, then we arrive at the deepest question hidden inside this story. What is the true function of a figure like Napoleon? The answer is not what most readers expect. The deepest revelation is that Napoleon is not primarily a character. He is a mechanism. He represents a recurring solution that human communities generate whenever uncertainty becomes psychologically unbearable. That is the layer many people miss. The story is not ultimately about one leader gaining influence. It is about the conditions under which people begin to prefer certainty over complexity, simplicity over ambiguity, and obedience over responsibility. Seen from this perspective, Napoleon's role changes completely. He is not the disease. He is the symptom. The symptom of a deeper human tendency. The tendency to seek relief from uncertainty by concentrating trust in a person, an institution, an ideology, or a system that promises answers. This is why the central conflict of the story is far more philosophical than political. The conflict is not between good intentions and bad intentions. It is between freedom and psychological comfort. Because genuine freedom is demanding. Freedom requires judgment. Freedom requires doubt. Freedom requires the ability to live with unanswered questions. Most importantly, freedom requires individuals to carry responsibility that cannot be delegated to someone else. That burden is heavier than many people realize. And this is where another memory fragment becomes extraordinarily important. Imagine standing in front of a set of principles that once inspired an entire community. The words still exist. The symbols still exist. The rituals still exist. Yet their meaning has quietly changed. Nothing appears dramatically different. And that is precisely the point. The most consequential transformations are often invisible while they are happening. Not because people are blind. Because adaptation feels normal. This leads to the core insight of the entire video. The greatest triumph of centralized power is not controlling behavior. It is reducing the desire for independent judgment. Once people become accustomed to receiving certainty from outside themselves, they gradually lose the habit of producing certainty from within. And when that habit disappears, control no longer needs to be imposed. It becomes self-sustaining. That is why the story remains relevant far beyond its historical context. It is not merely examining governments. It is examining a psychological pattern that can emerge anywhere. In political movements. In organizations. In communities. Even in ordinary personal relationships. Anywhere people exchange the discomfort of thinking for the comfort of being told what to think. The scale of the revelation now expands beyond institutions entirely. The story becomes a meditation on human nature itself. Perhaps the reason societies repeatedly recreate structures they once resisted is not because they fail to recognize danger. Perhaps they recognize it perfectly. Perhaps they simply fear uncertainty more. That possibility changes how we interpret nearly every symbol in the story. The changing principles. The fading memory. The unquestioned narratives. The promised future. None of them point primarily toward a political warning. Together they point toward a psychological warning. A warning about what happens when a community gradually loses its capacity for self-correction. And that leads to an unsettling philosophical conclusion. The survival of freedom may depend less on defeating powerful individuals and more on preserving habits of thought that make concentrated power unnecessary in the first place. But if that is true, then the consequences reach far beyond the boundaries of a single story. Because the question is no longer why a figure like Napoleon emerges. The question becomes, what happens to a civilization when fewer and fewer people are willing to carry the burden of independent judgment, and whether any society can preserve its founding ideals once that burden is abandoned? Once we understand that the deepest danger is the gradual abandonment of independent judgment, the next question becomes unavoidable: what is the cost? Not the immediate cost. Not the political cost. The deeper cost. The cost paid by a culture, by a community, and eventually by the human mind itself. Because every system leaves behind a legacy. Some leave monuments. Some leave laws. Some leave institutions. But the most enduring legacies are often invisible. They survive inside habits of thought. This is where the consequences of the story become far more significant than any individual character. The lasting impact is not that a particular leader gained influence. The lasting impact is that a population slowly adapted to a new definition of reality. And once a society adapts to a new reality, returning to the old one becomes extraordinarily difficult. Consider one of the most powerful memory fragments in the entire story, the fading ability to remember what came before. This is not simply a problem of historical knowledge. It is a problem of comparison. People can only measure change against something they still remember. When memory weakens, standards weaken. When standards weaken, expectations change. When expectations change, consequences that once seemed unacceptable begin to feel ordinary. That process does not merely affect institutions. It affects identity. Because communities are ultimately built from shared memories. Shared stories. Shared assumptions about what is true and what is worth protecting. When those foundations shift, people do not only lose information. They lose orientation. And that may be one of the most important legacies hidden inside the story. The erosion of judgment rarely begins with the destruction of truth. It begins with the erosion of reference points. The disappearance of reliable ways to evaluate truth. That insight expands the scale once again. Now we are no longer discussing a farm, a government, or even a political system. We are discussing a challenge faced by every generation. How do people preserve the ability to think clearly when the narratives surrounding them constantly evolve? How do they distinguish convenience from wisdom? How do they recognize gradual transformation before it becomes permanent? The story offers no simple answer. What it leaves behind instead is a warning encoded in symbols. The altered principles. The promised future. The labor offered in good faith. The memory that slowly fades. Each symbol points toward the same consequence. The greatest losses are often invisible while they are occurring. This is why the legacy of Napoleon is larger than his role within the story itself. His legacy is not domination. His legacy is a question. A question that continues to echo through history. What happens when a society becomes more skilled at maintaining certainty than questioning it? The consequences reach far beyond politics. Innovation slows. Self-correction weakens. Institutions become more fragile than they appear. People become increasingly dependent on inherited narratives rather than active understanding. And eventually an entire culture can mistake stability for strength. That distinction matters. Because stability can exist even when underlying weaknesses are growing. A building may look solid for years before a hidden crack becomes visible. A civilization may appear confident long after its capacity for self-correction has begun to decline. That is the deeper reflection Animal Farm leaves behind. The survival of a society depends not only on its ideals, but on its ability to continuously examine those ideals without fear. Without that ability, even the strongest principles can become empty symbols. And perhaps that is the final consequence of all. The transformation of living ideas into unquestioned rituals. Yet even after all of these layers are revealed, one paradox remains unresolved. If every community requires shared beliefs to remain united, but every shared belief risks becoming resistant to scrutiny over time, then how can any society preserve both cohesion and intellectual freedom without eventually sacrificing one for the other? Perhaps that is why this story endures long after its historical references have faded into the background. Not because it predicts a particular political outcome. Not because it explains a specific period of history. But because it forces us to confront a question that every generation eventually faces in its own way. How much of our understanding of the world truly belongs to us, and how much has been quietly inherited from the stories we have learned to trust? In the end, the most memorable images are not the characters themselves. They are the fragments left behind. A set of principles that slowly changed their meaning. A future that always seemed just beyond reach. A community that gradually lost the ability to distinguish between what was promised and what remained. These images linger because they point toward something deeply human. Human beings do not live by facts alone. We live by interpretation. We organize our lives around narratives, symbols, and assumptions that help us make sense of an uncertain world. That is not a weakness. In many ways, it is the foundation of civilization. Shared meaning allows strangers to cooperate. Shared values allow communities to survive. Shared stories allow societies to imagine a future together. Yet the same capacity that makes collective life possible also creates a permanent vulnerability. Every generation inherits ideas it did not create. Every society inherits institutions it did not build. Every individual inherits assumptions that often feel so natural they become invisible. And perhaps the deepest lesson hidden within this story is not that people are easily deceived. It is that meaning itself requires stewardship. The responsibility to remember why principles were created. The responsibility to question narratives without abandoning them. The responsibility to preserve freedom without allowing freedom to dissolve into chaos. These responsibilities never disappear. They simply pass from one generation to the next. That is why the legacy of this story extends beyond politics, beyond ideology, and even beyond literature. It becomes a reflection on maturity. Not personal maturity alone, but civilizational maturity. The ability of a community to live with complexity without demanding simple answers. The ability to remain united without becoming intellectually rigid. The ability to honor its values while continuing to examine them honestly. Those are difficult achievements. They always have been. And perhaps they always will be. When people remember this story, they often focus on the rise of power. Yet the more enduring image may be something quieter. A community standing among symbols it still recognizes, while no longer fully remembering what those symbols once meant. There is something profoundly tragic about that image. But there is also a warning, and perhaps even a form of hope. Because if meaning can slowly drift, it can also be rediscovered. If memory can weaken, it can also be renewed. If assumptions can harden into dogma, they can also be questioned again. The future is never shaped by institutions alone. It is shaped by the willingness of ordinary people to remain awake to the ideas that guide them. And perhaps that leaves us with the question that continues to echo long after the story ends. If every society depends on shared beliefs to survive, yet every shared belief risks becoming unquestioned over time, how do we preserve the stories that unite us without eventually becoming captive to them ourselves?